see the curve, you see developing countries is the blue, and Africa is the red, and the green is the world. And you can see that Africa is very much within the global average, the developing countries average, and way above the performance of the world average. We know that our economies accelerated during 2003 because of effects that it will be fastidious to present to you right now. But all predictions are that this year the growth is going to be anything between 5.5 and 6%. This puts us just 1% more or less from the magic 7, as I like to say. The magic 7 is because 7% is what you need to double GDP within a generation, or rather within a decade, and reduce poverty considerably within a generation. So if we get to magic 7, we are basically making sure that the emergence of Africa as a frontier market is going to be a reality for the entire continent. We see that this performance is going in that direction. The next slide demonstrates that despite the fact that economies in Africa can be quite different from oil-producing countries to non-oil producing countries, some mineral-rich, etc., you see that there is a convergence of all different types of configurations in Africa towards the same growth patterns. This is very encouraging because it means that we are no longer just dealing with what normally one of the stigmas say, that Africa has an oil curse, or if you want, a Dutch disease or a mineral curse. Because even if you look into countries that don't have those minerals, you see that the trends more or less go in the same direction, both the positive and the negative trends, meaning we are all growing, but we are not transforming. Neither the ones with oil or the ones that don't have oil. The transformation part is missing. It's missing in action. So we have to make sure that this is reversed, and that's what this report is proposing. In the next slide, you will see that we have some very good possibilities to arrest this negative news. For instance, in the column that you have on your left, you see the composition of exports from Africa to the rest of the world. And you can see that fuels, for instance, accounts for about 63%, quite a huge proportion of the total. And if you add to that ores and basically the mineral sector, we are talking about close to 80% of our exports are dependent on this type of commodities. And you can see that manufacturing goods is about 12%, which is relatively small. But look at the column on your right, which is exports intra-Africa, Africa to Africa. And you see the jump on manufacturing goods from 12% to 40%. That means basically that we have to put most of the efforts into creating an intra-African market for industrial products. That's where the key is. And don't believe this percentage that you hear all the time, that intra-Africa trade is only 12%. It is true that is only 12% the formal exchanges. But we know, you just go to one of the customs areas in any border in Africa, what happens there? Most of the transactions are not going through the formal sector. They are informal. And this is what we will have to transform also to modernize our systems, trade facilitation being one of them, to make sure that we foster intra-Africa trade, but we also formalize it, because that is going to increase the tax capabilities and the fiscal revenue that is so much needed for development. In the next slide, you see what is sort of the human dimension for all of this, because it's very good for us economists to give you all the technical reasons for industrialization, but there are also constraints that are quite important on the human capital formation. Some of the key social aspects, such as education, gender parity, women empowerment, although they are improving, we still have a long way to go. We know that the living population in extreme poverty has declined, but as I mentioned before, it's far too big in terms of size. I want, nevertheless, to put on record that if you compare it with India, that is a population more or less the size of Africa, Africa doesn't fare that badly. And in fact, its GDP per capita is higher than India. Policy interventions targeted at tackling inequality are also a very powerful instrument. That's why this report puts a lot of emphasis on how you can do industrialization at the same time be inclusive. The formula is very simple. It's mostly investing heavily on small and medium-scale enterprises, because that is what really expands employment opportunities and creates a spread that is necessary for us not to have just a couple of champions that make the Forbes list, but also that we make sure that that fortune is distributed. This is not the situation right now, and in fact there is an increase on inequality in Africa. For every celebration that we make of Africa having the six out of the 10 fastest growing countries of the world, we can also say that Africa has 6 out of the 10 most unequal countries of the world. And of course, the issues relating to the labor market are very positive in Africa, but also here the issue of informality is extremely important. A lot of the growth that we talk about in the continent is driven by 3 factors. The first factor is an appetite for investment. It's not the most important, but is growing. The second factor is the commodity prices boom, very vulnerable, as we know. It can go up and down. And the third factor, the most important, is internal consumption. The problem is that internal consumption is mostly coming from a boom in the services area. And as we know, most of this is creating informal jobs, not formal. In the next slide, we give you a bit of the idea of how productivity of our labor is going to be absolutely indispensable for Africa to be able to make industrialization. If you look into the graphs, basically you have at the top the agriculture employment share. In the middle, you have the services share. And at the bottom, you have the industrial share. What is impressive here is we continue to have the majority of the population in the agricultural sector. But guess what? It's contributing about just less than 5% of our richness. And if we continue with the same trends, in about 10 years, agriculture is going to contribute just about 1% of our richness. And yet, that's where most of the people are. Translate this into poverty. That's what it means. Productivity is not increasing. The number of people are too huge. Their size in terms of the cake is too small. So this is poverty. What we don't want is for this to just be transferred to the middle, the red curve, which is services, because what it means in practical terms in most of Africa is that we are translating this into jobs in the service areas in the cities, but informal. We don't want a situation where the poor just move from rural areas to slums. That's what can happen, and it's already happening. And that's why that last curve, the one at the bottom, cannot remain where it is. It has to jump considerably. That's the only way we are going to create modern jobs. In the next slide, you can see the contribution to GDP growth. Now is just not the size of the economy, but what is growing. And you see throughout the years, and the last one being the 2005-2009 period, the contribution of services keeps increasing. And we don't want that growth where the part that is the most important, agriculture, transformation, and industrialization, is not really happening. This is one of the best graphs to demonstrate the need for us to completely change the correlation. The contribution of agriculture to growth has diminished over time, and this decline has been compensated very much by industry and agriculture in equal proportions. The next slide, we try to demonstrate how the productivity, again, of the growth patterns of the continent is essential for transformation. And here, there are basically 4 points to be made. The first one is that to sustain productivity growth and further propel industrial development in the continent, we need a very targeted industrial policy. And this report makes very specific recommendations in that regard. particular sectors, and they change from country to country. It's very important to say. And that's why regional integration is so important, because we don't do all the same things. The second one is that we need to underscore the strong correlations between productivity and the institutional dimensions, coherence of policies. Ministries are aligned, they know what they are doing, there is a strategy. Basically, we are using one word, planning. We need better planning. And planning is not done like in the 70s again. This is planning like big multinationals will be able to tell us very easily. It's dynamic, it's interactive, and it makes sure that it is adjusted as we go by, because the volume of information and data available today is much higher than before, so we cannot go into static types of planning mechanisms. The third point to be made, and we see it from successful industrialization strategies in the studies coming from South Africa, Mauritius, and we also present the example of Vietnam, underscore the need for sectoral policy reforms, institutional change, and policy reforms which focus on innovation and technical skills. When you introduce the innovation dimension, that's where you can have an edge. Basically, the lesson learned is that because we are in a crowded environment, you have to outsmart others on something. It can be on marketing, it can be on a very specific edge from a technological point of view, it can be because of your productivity gains, it can be because you have good branding. Whatever it is, you have to outsmart the competition in one specific area of focus. And finally, in order for us to foster mobility of capital and labor from the low end to the high productivity activities, it has to be accompanied with some incentive policies, and this is for the state to put in place, mostly through regulatory systems. In the next slide, I'm not going to dwell into all the details, but you have it in the report. We try to demonstrate how this cycle of recommendations that we just made will work. It's very dynamic, and what you will see just from the graphic presentation that you have in front of you is that there are lots of points of entry. And you cannot just, it's not linear. That's the basic conclusion. It's not linear. You have to take advantage of opportunities as they pass by, and you have to grab them and make sure that you take advantage by having a very clear vision of where you want to go. And I can give examples of African countries that take advantage of any of these different points of entry. It can be institutional failures of others, it can be market failures, whatever, things that you identify that you can take advantage by correcting and being faster than others. Finally, in the next slide, the findings show that successful African countries, those who have done well, basically, have done well because they have coordination that starts way from the top, that they have industrial policy organizations, we are calling it in this jargon IPOs, that deal with the key issues, structural hollowness, sort of not being capable of articulating a relation between the vision and your objectives for the short and medium term. Operational failures, sometimes, you can have a lot of ambition from one particular ministry with the right incentives, but then the customs is doing something that undermines that. Or, you have your transport sector not collaborating with the macro policy of the government. Or lack of dynamism, people that think that it's going to happen just because we have some ingredients for it to happen. Without the dynamic leadership, it's not going to happen. And of course, we identified institutional gaps that confirm that finding. In the next slide, towards a dynamic industrial policy, we have basically the recommendations of the report in a succinct way. I'm not going to read them one by one because it's very much based on what I just presented to you. But what I think is the lesson for us doing this report is that industrialization is definitely possible in the continent. And we are on the verge of making sure that it happens. If you look into the debate right now, it's all about industrialization. 1 year ago, it was not. So this is just 1 year, the debate changed completely. All the resolutions of the January summit of heads of state in Africa and the recently held Conference of Ministers of Finance and Economic Development are about putting industrialization as the key priority for the continent. We even had, for the first time, the governors of central banks of Africa also lining up to support this endeavor by making sure that their mandates are interpreted beyond the rigidity that normally they apply to themselves, stability of prices and inflation control. They said, now we understand we have also a role to play on transformation. And without the role of the central banks, it's very difficult, for instance, to make sure that things like our reserves are used for development opportunities. So the debate has changed, and because the debate has changed, we want you all to benefit from this very rich and intensive dialogue that is taking place within African institutions. And my last word is, for more information, you can, of course, visit an interactive website that has been put together to basically dialogue through the site with different parts of the report. And I want just to explain to you why the report cover as that map of Africa within a bar-coded, which is like the symbol of industrialization that goes outside the continent. This is to demonstrate graphically that global value chains today do not allow for one product to be done from A to Z in the same place. So Africa is competing in a global value chain. And if it doesn't learn from what is going on in the world and around it, it's not going to make it inside it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for having brought this report alive in such a comprehensive way. And may we now open the floor to your questions and to your comments. Please tell us to whom those questions are being directed. We're going to take 3-4 questions at a time, and the panelists have agreed to try and answer the questions. So may we open the floor, please. Yeah. Please.